The moment my mother-in-law slid the papers across the Thanksgiving table, I realized she had never once believed I belonged in her family. She did not yell, she did not threaten me loudly. Evelyn Whitmore never needed volume to terrify people. She weaponized politeness better than most people weaponized rage. "Sign it before dessert, sweetheart," she said softly while lifting her wine glass. "Otherwise my son will file for an annulment first thing Monday morning." The entire dining room went silent so quickly that even the crackling fireplace sounded loud. I stared down at the stack of papers resting beside my plate. 14 pages, thick ivory paper, expensive legal formatting. A postnuptial agreement designed to leave me with absolutely nothing if my marriage ever ended. Every paragraph had already been highlighted with neat little tabs where they expected my signature. Someone had even placed a fountain pen beside the papers like it belonged there next to the silverware. Across from me, my husband Ethan kept his eyes fixed on his drink. He looked trapped somewhere between guilt and cowardice. His father Richard sat at the head of the table carving turkey with calm precision, as if this entire humiliation had been scheduled between appetizers and dessert. Ethan's sister Carolyn leaned back in her chair examining her manicure with fake boredom, while her husband Grant quietly watched me the same way people watch a storm rolling toward them from a distance. 3 years earlier, I had married into the Whitmore family believing love could survive class differences, old money arrogance, and subtle cruelty. 3 years later, I was sitting beneath crystal chandeliers while people discussed dismantling my marriage like a business negotiation. Before I tell you what happened after I opened my purse and placed something far more dangerous than a signature onto that table, you need to understand exactly who the Whitmores were and why they believed they had already won. The Whitmore estate sat on nearly 40 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut. Everything about the property screamed inherited power. The iron gates alone probably cost more than the apartment building where I grew up in Cleveland. The driveway curved through manicured gardens and frozen fountains before reaching a massive stone mansion that looked less like a home and more like a private museum for rich people who wanted to impress other rich people. The first time I visited the estate, I made the mistake of thinking they were simply formal people. I told myself Evelyn was reserved because she came from old money. I told myself Richard seemed cold because powerful businessmen rarely looked relaxed. I convinced myself Carolyn was sarcastic because she felt protective of her brother. What I failed to understand was much simpler. They had already categorized me. To them, I was the pretty middle-class girl who somehow caught the attention of the Whitmore heir, nothing more. They saw my modest upbringing, my public school education, my mother working double shifts as a cashier after my father disappeared when I was 6. And they quietly decided they understood everything about me. People like the Whitmores never asked questions when they thought they already knew the answers. That was their first mistake. Evelyn folded her hands neatly on the tablecloth and gave me the same expression she used on waiters who brought the wrong wine. Calm disappointment, controlled superiority. "Madeline," she said gently, "nobody is trying to hurt you. This is simply about protecting family assets. Surely you understand that." "Protecting them from me?" I asked. Carolyn gave a little laugh before taking a sip of wine. Her smile always reminded me of someone petting a dog they did not actually like. "Please do not make this emotional," she said. "You came into this marriage with very little financially. The agreement just establishes boundaries if things become complicated later. Your background was the phrase they loved using around me. Your background meant my childhood apartment with peeling paint and broken heating during Ohio winters. Your background meant community college before scholarships. Your background meant working 3 jobs while teaching myself software engineering at night. Your background meant not inheriting wealth from dead relatives with trust funds. To the Whitmores, poverty was not temporary circumstance, it was identity, permanent, contagious. I looked toward Ethan hoping for something, a defense, a protest, anything. Instead he finally spoke in the weakest voice imaginable. "Maybe we should all just stay calm." I almost laughed. Stay calm. His mother had just threatened to erase our marriage while serving cranberry sauce, and he wanted everyone calm. Richard set his knife down carefully and looked directly at me for the first time all evening. "If you refuse to sign, we proceed with legal action Monday morning," he said. "Our attorneys are prepared to argue fraudulent intent. You misrepresented yourself to this family." I blinked slowly. "Fraudulent intent," I repeated. Grant cleared his throat. He was the polished one. Corporate attorney, Yale graduate, the Whitmore family fixer whenever they needed someone to sound reasonable while delivering ugly threats. "We investigated your company, Madeline," he said calmly. Public records show your annual business revenue was under $60,000 last year. Nobody is accusing you of anything criminal. We simply want clarity regarding financial expectations. I stared at him for several seconds, then I almost smiled, because that was the exact moment I realized just how catastrophically little they actually knew about me. You checked public filings? I asked. Grant nodded confidently. Interesting. Ethan finally looked at me then, and I noticed confusion beginning to creep into his expression. I reached for my wine glass, took a slow sip, then set it down carefully. Take out your phones, I said. Nobody moved. Search for ether dynamics. Carolyn frowned immediately. What is that supposed to mean? Just search it, I repeated calmly. Something in my tone finally made Ethan reach for his phone. I watched him type the name, watched his eyes scan the screen. Then I watched the color drain from his face. What the hell, ... he whispered. Richard grabbed his own phone next. Carolyn followed. Grant took slightly longer, but once he did, his entire posture changed. Evelyn still had not touched her phone. She hated technology the way royalty hates commoners. She preferred receiving information from assistants rather than discovering it herself. Nobody spoke for almost 20 seconds. Ether Dynamics was not the name on my business cards. It was not the name attached to the small consulting company the Whitmores had investigated. Ether Dynamics was the parent corporation sitting quietly above 14 separate subsidiaries spread across cybersecurity, banking infrastructure, AI logistics, and defense software. 2 years earlier, Forbes estimated the company valuation at $2.4 billion. I founded it when I was 24. Evelyn finally looked around the table, irritated by the silence. Somebody explain what everyone is staring at. Richard slowly lowered his phone like it had suddenly become dangerous to hold. You own this company? He asked. I nodded once. Technically several companies, yes. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ethan stared at me like he had never seen me before. You told me you ran a software business. I do. Madeline, this says your company contracts with the Department of Defense. One of them does. Carolyn suddenly leaned forward. You hid this from us. I looked directly at her. No, you never asked. That landed harder than shouting ever could have, because it was true. I had never lied to Ethan, not once. On our third date, sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment eating cheap Chinese takeout because I could not justify buying furniture yet, I told him I was building something important. I told him I worked constantly because I intended to create a company that would outlast me. He smiled and called me ambitious. Then he changed the subject. People hear what they expect to hear. The Whitmores saw an ordinary woman, so every answer I gave them automatically became ordinary inside their minds. Evelyn finally picked up her own phone. Her expression barely changed while reading, which honestly impressed me a little. Most people would have looked horrified. Evelyn simply looked irritated that reality had failed to cooperate with her assumptions. How long? She asked quietly. Since before I met Ethan. Grant looked genuinely shaken now. The $60,000 filing was for a shell administrative entity, I said. One small piece of a much larger structure. Richard leaned back heavily in his chair. This is absurd. No, I replied softly. This is incomplete information. Nobody touched their food anymore. Outside, snow had started falling across the estate grounds, covering the massive windows with soft white streaks. Inside, the room felt suddenly smaller despite its size. Then my mind drifted backward 3 years to the first private conversation Evelyn and I ever had. It happened shortly after Ethan proposed. She invited me into her library after dinner while the men smoked cigars outside. I remember feeling nervous but hopeful. I thought maybe she wanted to know me better. Instead, she poured tea, sat across from me, and spoke in that same terrifyingly polite voice. Ethan has always been generous with people, she said, especially women who need saving. He mistakes admiration for love sometimes. I remember sitting very still while she continued. I do not know your intentions, Madeline, but I know exactly how the world works. Families like ours survive because we protect ourselves from opportunists before problems begin. I was 29 years old and exhausted from building a company almost nobody believed in yet. I had spent years sleeping beside laptops and eating vending machine dinners while trying to keep employees paid during impossible quarters. I had survived investors talking down to me, executives dismissing me, men repeating my own ideas back to me in meetings as if they invented them. Still, somehow, that conversation with Evelyn hurt more than all of it, because she looked at me with certainty, not curiosity. Certainty, and once powerful people become certain about who you are, they stop seeing you entirely. I returned to the present when Richard suddenly spoke again. Why keep this hidden? I folded my napkin slowly. because I wanted one place in my life where nobody cared about my money. That answer hit Ethan hardest. I could see it in his face immediately, because deep down he knew the truth. I had loved him before understanding exactly how wealthy his family really was. But his family had spent years assuming the opposite about me. Carolyn crossed her arms. This feels manipulative. I laughed softly then, not because it was funny, but because the irony was unbelievable. Manipulative, Carolyn, your family handed me legal papers during Thanksgiving dinner. Nobody answered that. I reached into my purse slowly. And this is where things changed completely. Because I had not come unprepared. I pulled out a thick folder and placed it beside the untouched postnuptial agreement. 18 months ago, I began acquiring controlling interests in several financial institutions through subsidiary investment groups, I said calmly. One of those institutions was Ashford Commercial Capital. Richard frowned instantly. We use Ashford. I know. His face changed. The Whitmore Group had refinanced 3 major real estate developments through Ashford 2 years earlier. $12 million total, variable commercial credit structure. Grant suddenly sat upright. No way. I opened the folder. The account entered technical default 31 days ago after missing a balloon payment deadline tied to covenant requirements. Richard stood so quickly his chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. You cannot be serious. I looked directly at him. Sit down, Richard. The room froze. Not because I raised my voice. Because I did not. For the first time since I entered that house, I spoke to him with the exact same controlled authority he always used on everyone else. And to my surprise, he actually sat down. I closed the folder again carefully. Relax. I have no intention of accelerating the debt or harming your properties. Your businesses are safe. That is not why I brought this tonight. Then why bring it? Grant asked quietly. Because all evening your family has spoken to me like I should feel grateful for being allowed into this room. I simply thought everyone deserved accurate context before continuing the conversation. Grant looked pale now, but I was not finished. There was one more thing. Actually, Grant, since you mentioned due diligence earlier, we should probably discuss Trident Holdings too. His entire body stiffened. Carolyn looked confused. What about Trident? I kept my eyes on Grant. The private investment account using insider information regarding Helix Biotech FDA approvals. Carolyn slowly turned toward her husband. Grant said nothing. Last September my company acquired the auditing firm connected to those communications. Internal compliance flagged irregular activity. 6 days ago I voluntarily forwarded the findings to federal investigators. Carolyn stared at him in horror. Tell me that is not true. Grant looked like a man watching his life collapse in slow motion. Evelyn finally lost control of her composure. What exactly are you doing right now? I met her eyes calmly, responding. That was the honest answer. Not revenge, not cruelty. Response. For 3 years I tolerated subtle humiliation because I loved Ethan enough to keep trying. I attended charity galas where people assumed I was decorative. I sat through dinners listening to jokes about working-class women marrying rich men. I watched his family evaluate my clothes, my manners, my vocabulary, my worth. And through all of it, I stayed polite. I waited for them to eventually see me clearly. But some people never see clearly until reality humiliates them first. Then headlights appeared outside the dining room windows. 2 black SUVs rolled slowly up the driveway through the falling snow. Nobody spoke. I already knew who it was. Grant looked physically ill. What did you do? Carolyn whispered. I authorized cooperation with federal investigators regarding the Trident matter. I said. They requested an interview tonight. You brought federal agents to Thanksgiving dinner. Richard exploded. No, I corrected calmly. You invited me to dinner. The investigators were already scheduled. The front doorbell echoed through the mansion. Nobody moved. Evelyn stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not superiority. Calculation. For the first time since meeting her, she genuinely did not know how to control the situation. What do you want? She asked finally. The room fell silent again. And suddenly I realized I no longer cared about humiliating them. I was just tired. I looked at Ethan. I want my husband to actually see me. His eyes filled with something painful. Madeline, no, listen to me. I interrupted softly. For 3 years your family treated me like a threat because I did not come from money. And every single time they diminished me, you stayed quiet because it was easier than challenging them. He lowered his head. Did you know about the postnuptial agreement? A long silence followed. Then he nodded once. They said it was precautionary. I smiled subtly. Of course they did. The doorbell rang again downstairs. Carolyn looked close to tears now. Richard looked furious. Grant looked destroyed. Evelyn looked older than she had an hour earlier. I stood slowly from my chair. I do not hate any of you, I said quietly. That is the strange part. I genuinely do not. But tonight you placed 14 pages in front of me because you thought I was beneath you. And the worst part is you never even bothered learning who I actually was first. I picked up the unsigned agreement and slid it back across the table. You saw a middle-class girl and assumed she married into power. It never occurred to you she might have built her own. Nobody spoke, because there was nothing left to say. I turned toward Ethan one last time. I booked a suite at the Langford Hotel downtown. If you want to talk honestly, without your family speaking for you, come tomorrow. Then I paused. But if you show up, come as yourself, not as a Whitmore. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the front entrance while the doorbell continued echoing through the mansion. As I passed through the foyer, I caught sight of family portraits lining the walls. Generations of Whitmores staring down proudly from oil paintings. Men in suits, women in pearls, decades of inherited certainty. For years that family made me feel small standing inside their house. That night, for the first time, it looked small to me. Outside, the winter air hit my face sharply. Snow crunched beneath my heels as I crossed the driveway. One of the federal investigators stepped aside politely to let me pass. I nodded once without slowing down. My car waited near the gates facing outward, deliberately, because some part of me always knew I might eventually need an exit. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door quietly. For a moment, I just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel watching warm golden light spill from the mansion windows into the snow. My phone buzzed. A message from my chief operating officer, Rebecca. Everything secured on the Ashford documentation. Also, the journal is requesting comment regarding the Trident investigation. How should we proceed? I typed one word back. Monday. Then another message arrived a few seconds later. You okay? I stared at the question longer than expected. Finally, I answered honestly. I think so, because strangely enough, I did not feel victorious. I felt finished. Finished trying to earn approval from people determined not to give it. Finished shrinking myself to make arrogant people comfortable. Finished mistaking tolerance for acceptance. And somehow that felt lighter than revenge. As I drove through the iron gates, I thought about my mother back in Ohio. Tomorrow I would call her and she would probably say something simple and grounding like she always did. Something that cut through all the wealth and drama and ego. My mother never cared how much money people had. She cared whether they were kind. Funny how the poorest person I knew understood human value better than the richest family in Connecticut. At the final curve of the driveway, I glanced once more in the rearview mirror. The Whitmore mansion stood glowing against the snowy darkness. Massive and elegant and convinced of its own importance. But for the first time since marrying into that family, I no longer felt intimidated by it. Because that night I finally understood something powerful. I had spent years believing I was fighting for a seat at their table. The truth was, I had built my own table long before I ever met them.